Welcome to Big Closet Small Planet and this special edition for the Scandinavian Textile Initiative's Climate Action Week. So, we are continuing our conversations around different aspects of climate action. Of course, in this case, I am still keen to dive deep into how we address vulnerable people, just transition concepts. And so, we have a very excellent guest today to discuss that from the Laudes Foundation. In a second, I will let him introduce himself. But I wanted to just note, because we recently, as part of this series, also interviewed Nandita Shivakumar, who is a labor representative from Tamil Nadu Textile and Common Labor Union in India. And I thought so appropriate. She just posted on LinkedIn this issue of heat stress, right? So one of the labor representatives, according to her post, a trade union leader, basically fainted on the factory floor due to heat stress, according to Nandita. And her point was this, that the health issues that are reported for many of the workers are chronic exhaustion, heat rashes, hemorrhoids, menstrual disorders, problems with the urine, urinary tract infections. And the point her post is making is that, brands are proudly advertising their goals of sustainability, modern slavery pledges, ESG ratings in the global north, while women sewing the clothes in the global south are collapsing from heat and denied even the most basic rights. But I think the context is clear, and we did interview Nandita in another pod that you'll be hearing during the Climate Action Week. But, this issue of just transition, we want to talk about what does it mean in practice? We have things happening now due to global warming and climate change. We have things going to happen in the future. How do we make sense of this so that it moves from a principle to practice that really makes a difference? So I'm very glad to have Amol Mehra from the Laudes Foundation, who is going to speak a little bit about how Laudes currently sees this and what their vision is for the future. So Amol, I would love you to introduce yourself, your background, what you do at the Laudes Foundation.
Yeah, sure. Hey, thanks so much for the invitation, Michael, and for putting together this podcast. What a great set of interviews that you'll be doing, including with some of our partners, which I was really grateful to see. So yeah, let me step back and tell you a little bit about me and about the Laudes Foundation, because I do think it's important context as we dive deeper into this opportunity of the just transition. So Laudes Foundation, we kickstarted about 2019, 2020 after a few years of the CNA Foundation, which folks probably know in the apparel space. This was a foundation really dedicated to advancing labor issues and some environmental causes in the context of circularity, et cetera, in the fashion sector. What we did then was add other industries and really focused our work on addressing the dual crises of climate and inequality. In more recent years, we've kind of brought these worlds together with a dedicated focus on the just transition of industries. So our lens is very much operating with and through industry, but the work very much focuses on how can we shift the makeup of different actors like workers, producers, and communities, policymakers, finance, and investors, and business themselves to drive a more just economy and just industries. And that's really our focus. Personally, I come to this work having been a lawyer in business and human rights for now over almost 15 to 18 years, and really saw the evolution of corporate sustainability into a real path for how businesses could put values at the core of their value. So to think about what dignity of people and the planet meant in the course of business operations. And so what we do at Laudes is very much an extension of that. How do we ensure that business acts as a force for good on these various issues?
So very interesting in terms of your background as a human rights lawyer. We can talk a little bit about policy and such also, I hope. So these ideas, I think most people subscribe to. Of course, there are questions about what can business do for good and what needs to be legislated. But when it comes to the just transition, which seems to be an important part, How does it look in fashion in particular from your point of view? What are you trying to do with this work in fashion?
Yeah. Okay. Let me also start by giving you a bit of context because this is a term that has a lot of perhaps confusion or is used sometimes in vague ways. For us, it's really critical that we ground the work and framing of the just transition in commonly defined international process and law. The International Labor Organization defines it as greening the economy in a way that's fair to and inclusive as possible to everyone concerned, creating decent work opportunities and leaving no one behind. So, for us, within that definition, there are really key components that are core to how we view industry action on the just transition. The first is generally a commitment to decarbonization in a way that is efficient and moving at speed, but in so doing, in a way that centers the dignity and the inclusion, agency, and accountability for workers and producers and communities in that case. So let's take the fashion industry for a deep dive here. As you mentioned, and as Nandita explains, the fashion industry is an employer of some 75 to 80 million people globally, with a significant portion of them being women, and many of those in informal labor conditions. So this is a sector that has a huge people footprint. But at the same time, it also has a carbon and emissions footprint. Under 10% of global carbon emissions come from the sector. But importantly, and I think we all see this everywhere now gaining attention, this idea of textile waste and the clothes that we wear and then discard, is growing at a record pace. 92 million tons are discarded every year. So when you ask what is the role of fashion in supporting a just transition, you really need to bring those concepts together. How can fashion brands and the entire fashion supply chain address the impacts of this sector on people in terms of the labor and community impacts, and on carbon in terms of the emissions of factories, the shipping, et cetera, and on nature and biodiversity in terms of effluents and discharge, et cetera. So there you see the opportunity for fashion to play a role in driving that force for good.
And so that's the Laudes Foundation's approach to say
Right.
this is crucial to what we do, and we are trying in then practice to address this. And how are you to date putting these ideas into practice?
Yeah. So, as a foundation, what our business is essentially to fund, to provide philanthropic capital to leading initiatives from, let's say, worker cooperatives that are looking at these issues to business initiatives that are starting to tackle these challenges. So, we fund various efforts around the world. Our key markets of focus tend to be in Europe and in Asia, in Bangladesh and in India, and we're looking at other markets where fashion has a footprint in our fashion portfolio specifically. So, what does it mean to fund? Well, we initiate investments in organizations that are trying to tackle various parts of this challenge. In fashion circularity, by promoting a circular fashion system, we're really looking at the issue of fashion and textile waste. So, how do we bring a just transition to that issue? Well, if you think about the amount of clothes that are discarded and you think about the workers that are involved at that aspect of the supply chain, many of those are informal waste workers that lack any real sort of social protection.
Okay.
These are people that pick the waste, that sort it, that recycle textiles. But how do you integrate those people meaningfully into the change and the transition of the fashion sector? What would it look like to provide dignity in that workforce as a key component of looking at circular fashion systems? So that's the kind of work we do. For instance, we're funding a partner called the Restart Alliance that brings together Fashion for Good, IDH, and a few others, and really looking at how we can support those informal waste workers to play a central role in a more circular supply chain.
Okay, so though that's an interesting angle.
Mm-hmm.
I know I talked to Lakshmi about this, your colleague, about
Mm-hmm.
this being a future agenda item for Laudes. Uh, so sort of that area is a growing area of the secondhand and recycled markets in vulnerable regions. Uh, what about these issues when it comes to adaptation, right? That Nandita is talking about.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Good point. And this is something that we are quickly moving on. Last year, we supported, along with Quadrature Climate Foundation and a few other foundations, the standing up of a new collaborative of donors called the Adaptation and Resilience Collaborative, or ARC. This is a network now of, I believe, more than 40 donors that are committing philanthropic capital to addressing key adaptation topics, adaptation and resilience topics. One of the core entry points for our work is around the issue of extreme heat. So, as Nandita mentions very clearly, these factories are often in countries and contexts that are experiencing increasing heat stress. We can only look at the headlines every year to see record high temperatures being set in places like Delhi and in Dhaka. So, what does it mean for workers who are on factory floors all day, toiling and producing garment? These types of stresses are often not really in the scope of what mainstream core labor issues look at, like wages and union rights, but they're increasingly showing up. So, as part of our work, we've been supporting a number of organizations looking at the issue of heat stress. One of them is an organization called Climate Resilience for All, which centers predominantly women's and gender sort of lens in their work, but very much focused on extreme heat.
And you've also funded Jason Judd, right? And his
Indeed.
Cornell Institute, right?
Yeah.
And we have interviewed Jason for this series as well.
Oh, fantastic. And Jason, just like he is to do, is often ahead of the issues. You know, Jason's work we funded 3 or 4 years ago, and it led to a groundbreaking report looking at the risks that industry faces also from these types of exposure risks in their supply chain, from sea level rise to extreme heat. And, you know, what Jason did so powerfully in that piece was shows that this isn't just a human rights imperative or a climate imperative. This is also a business imperative to act on, and that
Okay.
very much lines up with
Yeah,
our
I'm jumping
viewpoint.
in now, and
Yeah,
because my mind now is racing because we've
go.
gotten the background,
Yeah.
and I'm like, okay, I got a lot of juicy questions here.
All right.
Um,
Here we go.
here we go. So we have the one thing which is, let me ask you, if you were to rate on a
Yeah.
scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the industry and its stakeholders are doing great
Mm.
on just transition implementation, and 1 being terrible, from your perspective at this point, what would you give the industry and its stakeholders in terms of a rating?
Look, I think this is a nascent issue. I'd probably lean more towards the 1 or 2. I
Okay.
think understanding, I think the world has been so divided on the way it looks at climate and rights issues. If you even look within a company, oftentimes these issues are set up with different teams, oftentimes visiting the same suppliers, asking questions about labor on a Monday, and then an exact team looking at carbon emissions or effluent coming in on a Wednesday or Thursday, not knowing that the team happened on a Monday on labor issues. So you see these issues being approached internally differently. And so what we're really trying to argue is that there is a nexus here between that decarbonization approach and the dignity and inclusion of workers. And doing it right means understanding that there can be beneficial outcomes for workers and communities by putting them at the core of how you do your decarbonization.
Okay, and this is what we're trying to get at, because as you say, it's a nascent area.
Yeah.
The idea of sort of workers' rights and social protections and freedom of association, this is not new, and this is the industry has been, I would argue, struggling for a very long time with, struggling maybe even an understatement. And now we're putting in the context of climate action. And some would say that decarbonization, when you call it that, it sort of narrows the focus of what climate action should be. That climate action has to be broader because of its current and future implications for communities, vulnerable communities who produce the clothes, and the factories and those things that produce the clothes. So it seems like you're arguing that as well, that decarbonization is sort of a technical term for reducing the emissions in line with what science says. But even so, even if you're doing that, the heat stress happens, The communities are going to have to sort of address, what's going to happen no matter what. And is it the responsibility of the apparel industry and its stakeholders to step in and address that, uh, even if we're successful at sort of what we can do with decarbonization? Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I think that's a good and articulate way of summing up where there could be a perceived dichotomy of approach. I would argue, though, that the just transition engages in a range of both mitigation and adaptation and actions for it to be truly realized. For instance, a social protection scheme that may or may not exist to protect workers from, let's say, floods or heat stresses is a clear adaptation action that enables a just transition to take place. Just the same as a factory moving its energy source from, let's say, a coal-fired plant to on-site energy generation through renewables. So both of those interventions lead to a just transition. So I would argue indeed that it is much more beyond just pure carbon emissions reductions, and a just transition needs to factor in a whole range of potential actions that could enable it.
And how, as a philanthropic organization, uh, and you're funding certain activities now and building this into your future agenda, you've talked about also a particular segment of this was in the recycling. Did I get that right? In the
Right.
recycling
Mm-hmm.
aspect and how those workers and future workers are going to be affected. What would you like to see as a vision? Where do you want
Yeah.
to go with this? And I think about also not only for the Laudes Foundation, but for the industry.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think the reality is that there's this notion that needs to get myth busted that the success or failure of a fashion transformation starts with brands. I mean, the reality is the missing middle of the supply chain is where most of the action will live or die. As companies understand and try to act on their scope beyond their scope 1 and 2 emissions, they have to understand the implications deeper in their supply chain. They then need to understand or think about what their responsibilities are to enable deeper supply chain action on the transition. So, a vision for the sector is one that has obligations and responsibilities across the sector and opportunities for brands to leverage their buying power, finance to invest in and enable, and suppliers to step up and say, hey, look, we also want to build a future fit industry, and here's what we're willing to do that. All of that needs to exist within a policy environment, and that's why Laudes is so keen to support strong and implementable rules that lift the floor and set a standard, because that's what will now allow the front runners to lead.
And that I wanted to get at that, which is there are there are those who say, and you seem to be implying it, but I don't want to put words in your mouth here, which is that there needs to be a bit of a paradigm shift. Some would say a major paradigm shift. There's a critique from manufacturers, often in those places where a lot of the greenhouse gases are created, right, through wet processing and the
Right.
coal-based energy and those sorts of things. That the big burden falls upon them to do the
Right.
work, and this is something you know and have heard about. And they're saying, often now it's brand led, this climate stuff, the climate action. The brands are sort of dictating how it should be done, when it should be done, by when, um, and that's not going to work, right?
Yep.
There's a sense that it should be actually, let's change the paradigm altogether. Should it be, uh, you know, uh, manufacturer led and worker led? That these environments, when we're meeting to discuss these things, are not including the manufacturers sufficiently.
Right.
They're not able to determine sort of the course of their work. Workers are definitely left out. Have they been in other cases already? And this is just a recipe for not succeeding in
Right.
any way. Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I think that's entirely the diagnosis here. The reality is that suppliers have been, in large part, left behind in the conversations of the transition. it's been dominated largely as I think, in my opinion, a Western kind of approach to decarbonization. And, even if you look at the major initiatives, they've been very much focused on Western brand leadership here, when the reality is most of the emissions are centered deeper within the supply chain. So the question then begs is, how do you make sure suppliers are at the center of that transition? How do we support and enable their participation in industry initiatives that are seeking to decarbonize or move towards a more sort of nature and biodiversity positive approach? And so, this is where it comes back to our core principles that we believe are core to the just transition, which is the idea of inclusion, the idea of agency, and the idea of accountability.
Mm.
How do we put the supplier in the dialogue? That's inclusion. How do we ensure that the supplier has power in that dialogue, that they have the ability to shape outcomes? That's their agency. And then how do we ensure that the eventual outcome benefits and enables them to continue? That's the accountability. So those three pillars are core to how we view a just transition playing out. Let me give you an example of a practical thing we're doing.
Okay, that would be good.
In Bangladesh, we're standing up what we are hoping will be a model for other countries that have a high export-oriented economy, but that are themselves at the front face of the climate catastrophe. Bangladesh is over 70% below the water table. There's significant potential of flooding in many areas where there is apparel production. So what we did was we stepped back and we said, how can we enable a multi-stakeholder approach to driving a just transition in Bangladesh? And the first group we engaged with were the manufacturers and the suppliers in the country. These are the core engine of the economic development of Bangladesh. And they are at the table. They are wanting to figure out how Bangladesh can be future fit for a sector and how they can lead in that charge. So we're standing up a Bangladesh Just Transition Center that will have manufacturers at the table, brand representatives at the table, international organizations, and workers and communities. And our idea is, hey, let's co-create what a future apparel industry in the country could look like. And let's do so by having those that will be in charge of implementing it help define what it's going to be.
Okay. Well, you're saying, and I don't say this in a cynical way, all the right things, right?
Yeah.
and that's concrete. What you're talking about, that is something, and I think that there's a number of experts we interviewed who would say, yeah, we're in line with that. That makes sense. But I often come back to the economic dynamics of the industry, right? So let me play the cynical person here.
Yeah, please.
We have buyers around the world who are first and foremost generally being asked to maximize profit, make
Right.
a profit. They generally, I would say, our margins are pressed, the models today. Their owners and shareholders say you need to deliver those profits every quarter or such. And they're saying, yeah, so that's my priority. And so we know that that has led to a certain approach to working with manufacturers. And that's been price pressing,
Right.
negotiating on price points, all those sorts of things. And ultimately, even if individuals in these companies have the right values and want to do right, if when push comes to shove, the master of profits and maximization
Yeah.
tends to win out over sustainability concerns and social concerns, a part of that. And so, again, putting on my cynical hat to say, and you talked about policy a little bit
Yeah.
briefly, aren't we sort of hoping that volunteer through social dialogue and such will lead to good outcomes without really saying we need to have some teeth, which is you need to be held accountable, you need to be penalized or incentivized for doing the right thing?
So let me take your point and break it into two parts that I take maybe one issue
Sure.
with and the second agreement with. So the
Okay.
first, I think that there is, and I want to be very clear about this because this is what I believe it will take to drive action and alignment. We need to start understanding that value creation comes from embedding sustainable practices and objectives into the core businesses. The climate crisis is a perfect example of where erosion of value can happen without factoring in risk and mitigation from climate. So, as Jason's work so clearly demonstrates, the sector is exposing itself to massive risk if it doesn't start understanding and acting on sustainability issues as core to how it does business. So that's one. I think maybe I would call that sort of the clarification.
Is that the
That
pushback you're giving me?
that's the pushback, which is that this
Okay.
isn't sustainability on the one hand and nice to do on the one hand versus
Right.
like
So we have the
core
business case,
business.
the risk management case for
Yeah,
companies.
I think the business case is increasingly becoming clear across sectors, not just in fashion. I
Okay, and I'm going to push
anticipate.
back on you to
Okay.
just
Yeah.
to say that I think on paper all that makes sense, but
Yeah.
in practice it's not so sure that that's what's happening in the boardrooms and such. We work with, for instance, not all the biggest companies, although H&M is one of them in our platform,
Yeah.
and they're different animals. But the medium-sized companies, yeah, I think they see this, but ultimately when push comes to shove, which happens often now, they don't invest in I would say this resilience, this risk management. I think
Yeah.
they're getting better at it in terms of conceptually, but do they actually make strategic decisions because of this? Ah, I would
Yeah.
say it's not really what's happening. But that doesn't mean that the ones I work with are the ones that you know of.
No, no, no. I would also agree with you that I don't think this is by far a norm. What I'm suggesting is that this is an opportunity. And
Right.
where there is opportunity, business will follow. So I think we will see, and I predict that we will see the emergence of a stronger business case for sustainability that unmoors us from this political debate over ESG or this moral debate about doing the right things on rights into a much more business oriented approach to saying, in a world that's getting hotter, in a world where we're seeing wild temperature and weather impacts, and in a world where labor is more impacted because of those impacts, then what do we do with our business and how do we mitigate and act on that risk? So I anticipate this will increasingly become part of business calculus and therefore I think help mainstream the way we approach things.
So this will just be the way businesses have to act to survive and thrive.
Look, I think so. I think if you look at, I'd encourage you to read a recent report from JP Morgan that came out about the
Mm.
sort of the imperative of resilience and adaptation planning from a finance perspective, put out
Okay.
by put out by them. It's really compelling reading for an investor audience from an investor audience, and I think it makes the case quite clearly that there are huge exposure risks of not taking this seriously. And I think on the flip side of risk is always opportunity. I think there's huge opportunities for businesses that are ahead of the curve here, that are investing in that resilient supply chain, that are enabling those factories to become, factories of the future by having a strong and inclusive workforce, by respecting labor rights, and also by ensuring that that there are conditions in those factories where people can work. And that means perhaps addressing potential flood zones or thinking about energy sources that enable temperatures to be adjusted without being reliant on antiquated energy systems. So
Okay.
I think there's a lot there. Let me just come to policy because I think this is
Yeah.
another
Good.
hook. And I think you're right to point out policy as an enabler. If policy is done right, which is so often not the case,
Mm.
right? So take a look at the European policy architecture around these issues and really does set a precedent. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and many other parts of the EU Green Deal really did set a precedent and an expectation of what business ought to do. I put aside the fact that these are being openly litigated in the omnibus package, but as a sort of indication of where countries could set a floor, they were quite clear. The challenge is many of those policies have to be implemented in countries that have no say or input into the development of those policies. Something we're really keen to do is to look at the policies and think about how they can be implemented with much more participation from countries and communities that stand to be impacted. So some grants we're doing, including on things like the EPR system here, extended producer responsibility. How do we lift the voices of Ghanaian and Indian and Bangladeshi communities who might be on the receiving end or involved in that supply chain to be able to kind of share their inputs so that the outcomes are more beneficial for all? So
Okay.
I think that there's a role in policy also around inclusion that makes policy better fit.
Right. That I can imagine. I mean, I do not know how many uh, regional, local voices, manufacturing voices are in the policy dialogues that we have in Europe at this point. Um, Very few, often symbolic.
Exactly.
Uh, I'm just imagining, though, a worst case scenario. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No,
I
it's
get
good. I
stuck.
like the cynic. It's good.
I'm not. I mean, we've been doing this a long time,
Yeah.
both of us, and so um, uh, there is a chance, right? We have all this resilient risk management, as you described, J.P. Morgan's approach to resilience. Fair enough, like it. There is a risk that you know companies who source will say, "I'm too small, I'm too
Right.
uninfluential to make a difference, and I need to shore up my supply chain." And well, either I'm in a situation where I can't go anywhere else, right? Because this is where I source my stuff, and I can't get a better situation elsewhere, or I'm like, I need to find a more resilient country or place to produce. It's just things are getting so bad,
Right.
water stress, heat stress, it's just not working for us, and we can't reach our climate targets and stay put where we're at.
Right.
And that's the world I'm worried about, is that we're talking about, of course, at one level, the operations of a company and its supply chain partners. On the other hand, we're talking about, as you say, like Bangladesh below the waterline. It's a whole society or community that's
Hmm.
going to be affected. And
Hmm.
in certain cases, it's societies and communities that very much deliver a majority of the clothing to the world. And yet we don't necessarily have like a global fund or sort of a sort of a commitment from the whole industry to also finance this kind of work beyond the value chain in
Right.
terms of what needs to be done. This feels like it needs to be a bigger mobilization. Governments, like you're trying to do,
Yeah.
governments,
Exactly.
actors, other philanthropic organizations. This is a big, big thing. We even have trouble getting the global community, right, at the max level of climate action to fund adaptation and
Right.
resilience, right? We haven't
Yeah.
met those targets. What's the chance we're going to get the fashion industry and its stakeholders to do that?
Yeah. It's funny. I started my career very much focused on corporate accountability, meaning I looked at sectors that had a lack of rules or leadership and tried to work on driving leadership behavior through campaigns, through legal tactics, through advocacy. And increasingly, as I saw the development and implementation of standards and how they were being adopted internally within companies, and also saw colleagues of mine go into these companies to help be change leaders from within, I realized that there's actually a lot of opportunity in supporting front runner leadership behavior from companies, but that they cannot do it on their own. And this is why I firmly believe in an ecosystem approach, for a jargony word, or a multi-stakeholder approach. What we mean there is that the reality is that business can, even at its best, drive the conditions that support entrepreneurship, employment, that help set value, build value in communities, et cetera. But that government has a really fundamental role to play in setting the rules of the game and protecting those that are the most vulnerable. So when you look at any intervention, I think you're quite right. You need to understand whose responsibility is it at this specific place. And then you need to think about where is there a potential alignment or orchestration of alignments that would enable an outcome to be achieved. When you look at the example I gave you about Bangladesh, we think such an orchestration is possible. You have a government that is export oriented and dependent on sourcing. You have a young urban population that are thirsty for jobs and that need employment. You have a sector that has historically relied on production from that geography. And you have a threat, which is climate and the attendant impacts. So, if we can align those pieces towards a sector that is resilient, a sector that employs workers with dignity, and that creates long term values for brands and suppliers, that alignment exists, and therefore it can be possible. That's what we're seeking, and that's the focus of what we're trying to do there. I think that's
That
a
makes sense.
microcosm of what we're
Yep.
trying to do globally.
So that makes sense. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking of a few things. One is, are we worried about the pullback from the United States and other countries in terms of their approach to development aid? And does that mean we need to step up even more as an industry?
Mm,
Um, there was that question. The second is, we know it's hard enough in Europe to go from legislation to enforcement, right?
right.
And what is that going to look like in countries that maybe have a less developed or different developed governmental engagement approach? These, of course, are all challenges, not necessarily things that we can't overcome. So I was thinking about those things, uh, and I was thinking, how do we? Mm, I, I just want to make sure that we're clear-eyed about
Yeah.
what this really means. Like, does your Bangladesh project have clear success criteria? Like,
Yeah.
we're gonna make sure that every factory in Bangladesh. Now, I'm just sort of throwing
Yeah.
things out there. Is outfitted with cooling and adaptation for cooling, so people don't pass out, and they are, the sort of they're given breaks more often because it's getting hotter, and we're also going to make sure the communities they live in have access to this or that. And we need, it feels like somehow, in order to go from principles
Yeah.
to implementation, we need to know what success looks like relatively specifically.
Yep, I agree, and I want to be very clear. Like, in no way are we Pollyannish about the time, the resource intensity, and or the risks of any of this. But the reality is, there's a dearth of ideas, and there's a dearth of, in my opinion, real strong mobilized action towards solution. We are existing in a period of time where everything is defined by negative, what you can't do, what we're losing, what we are standing, what's in our way. And actually, I think the beauty of industry and entrepreneurship is that it's about saying, given that context, what is winnable? And I do think the emergence of climate as a common threat faced by business, faced by workers and communities, and faced by government is such a galvanizing energy that could lead to different models of collaboration and different models of business. The path for us and our partners is finding those models, and for us as a foundation, supporting their articulation. And so that's really the business of what we're trying to do, is drive the front runner behavior with and through industry, and in so doing, make that outcome of just transition real. I think the success factors will be co-developed if we are in fact accurate and honest about creating multi-stakeholder collaboration.
Okay. And so, to round up, if you were to only have one wish,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say blank check. I think a wish is better. These are these classic questions, but I think it's a
Yeah.
good one wish that you could come true. I would say, let me give you a little more sort of immediate time frame that could come true in the next 6 months to a year, that would enable a speed up of this work in a just transition that you're advocating for. One thing that you think, there's plenty of things. Holistically, there's lots of things. But one thing you think, if this happened, this would really move things forward significantly.
I would say bold business leadership that recognizes value can be derived from putting sustainability into the core of your operations versus treating it like an externalized factor.
Okay, and bold leadership in the context, and now we're talking a little bit about just transition.
Yeah.
Would that mean that they, in addition to integrating things like how do we support
Let me
climate
give you an
adaptations
example.
in the
Yeah.
factories,
Yeah.
would that mean also engaging beyond the factory floor to ecosystem like projects like in Bangladesh?
Yeah, exactly. So let me be clear. Let's take the Bangladesh example because we're going to get this off the ground this year, ideally. Uh, there, it would be a major brand understanding that its supply chain and its commitment to future success depends on stitching and supporting the inclusion of suppliers and ensuring that they have the necessary commitments from that brand to invest in cleaning up their own operations and in supporting the dignity of their workers. That would be bold leadership. It would be building in the support in terms of purchase orders or long-term offtake agreements, et cetera, into how they do their business with these suppliers who are themselves going to be core to driving this just transition.
Very good, Amol. Thank you very much for the conversation today.
I appreciate the conversation and your leadership in bringing different voices to the front of this dialogue.